Good morning, Build Stuff. Welcome back. How you all doing out there? So it is my great pleasure to welcome our next speaker to our Build Stuff AC/DC stage here. Somebody who has spent many, many years working in software, not just technical, but on the organizational side of software as well. As the CTO and chief scientist at N26 in Germany, spent some time as a technical consultant working with ThoughtWorks. He's written 3 books about software evolutionary architecture, runs a newsletter for leaders in tech. Please welcome to the Build Stuff stage to talk about the secrets of a strong engineering culture. Give it up for Patrick Qua.
Thank you very much, Dylan. Thank you, and good morning, everyone. Welcome to ACDC stage and the talk about secrets to a strong engineering culture. We're going to talk about building stuff, and in this case, it's really about building the environment that you would like to work in so that everyone can rock on. But before we jump in, I want to talk about a little bit about my history, and I want to go to maybe compare 2 companies that I started off very early in my career. Now, when I started working, it was kind of at the height, or maybe I should say post the dot-com crash. Everything was hyping up. It was very exciting to get into technology, and then the dot-com crash happened, and I happened to join the industry. Now, there was a lot of, I guess, companies that weren't hiring, and there wasn't so much choice on the market. And so it was interesting with some of the companies I started working with. And 2 of the companies that I worked with were really good contrast that you can think of in terms of what their engineering culture was like. Now, to give you an example of this, we have 2 sort of companies that I've labeled Enterprise A and Startup A. Enterprise A was one of those companies where engineering discipline was really thought about in terms of rigorousness. So it was very common to have 200+ page design documents, thinking about architecture, specifications, and component design in quite a lot of detail. Compare this also to how they would think about planning. So their horizons were fairly long horizons. Their product roadmaps were mapped out for a year or 2 years. There was quite a lot of sort of customer commitment of really trying to understand what types of software that they wanted to build and how they were going to get there, which kind of incorporated the design documents and required the design documents to think about what would actually be feasible. Now, when I joined them, it was really interesting to see how they actually thought about decision making. And one of the interesting things that you notice in a sort of large enterprise is you have a lot of people with opinions. And of course, when you're planning out a 2-year roadmap with a lot of people who are involved in planning out those decisions, you have a lot of people who will naturally fight for their opinions. And so a lot of the product priorities and decisions about what you ended up building was based on these sort of opinions of highly paid people. Now, in a large enterprise, you have a lot of people, and naturally you have some level of coordination between people. And one of the interesting things I noticed was these large handoffs between departments and teams. So in order to accomplish something that was very, very large, you had very large teams distributed across many different countries. And in order to get things done, you had to have a very rigorous handoff processes where you would be onboarding and training other people about what had been built, or maybe telling people for sort of testing teams what things they should be testing, which required quite a lot of sort of rigor. And this is kind of the engineering culture between Enterprise A. Now, the next company I joined was quite an interesting contrast to this, and this is the startup land. Now, what was interesting here is back in that sort of time frame, we were sort of getting involved with user research and design. Now, user research and design wasn't such an established field as it is today, and we were working with one of the sort of earliest people that was really invested in user experience research, running workshops with people and trying to understand what consumer demand was. We were actually on a very interesting release cadence of every 2 weeks. To compare this, in the enterprise, we were planning releases every 3 to 6 months, 3 months being a really good cadence. And here we were releasing to our customers every 2 weeks, which was like an interesting place to be. The other thing is, since we could release every sort of 2 weeks, we weren't really planning out everything for a 2-year roadmap. As a startup, you can't afford to do this. You just simply don't have the resources and capacity. And so we ended up having monthly idea sessions in terms of taking in user feedback based on the current research, understanding what would bring the business forward, and actually trying to then think about what would be the quickest way or most effective way of delivering that sort of idea or outcome. And one of the interesting things I experienced as a developer very early on was actually dealing with production support. So unlike the enterprise where support was operated by 2 or 3 departments away and I never really understood what was going on, as a developer in this startup, I was actually responsible for when things would go wrong. This was a terrifying experience, but also an interesting learning experience at the same time. And so when we think about each of these two different contrasts, for me, one of the interesting questions here is to ask yourself, what is the engineering culture that both of these companies possess? But also, what is the engineering culture that you want to propagate and encourage and create for your future technical team? So what we're on here today is really the quest for understanding the secrets to really good engineering culture. And I want to sort of explain about why that's important. But I'm going to take a step back and explain perhaps who I am so you understand who your guide is for today. As Dylan mentioned, I've been working in technology for quite some time, 20 years. I've done everything from being a developer, tech lead, to a CTO, and I understand all the sort of stages that are involved in building and evolving software in many different organizations. Having done consulting for 14 years, I've also seen many different companies, and so observed a lot of the different engineering cultures that people have had. And some environments, I will say, are more attractive to engineers than others. And this is an interesting question when you're thinking about building stuff, if you're going to attract engineers so that they can build software for customers. I published a number of different books, as Dylan mentioned, and I run a free newsletter for leaders in tech that you're also welcome to sign up for. But in terms of our journey today, I'm going to talk about why this is an important element of understanding why engineering culture matters. Then we're going to look at these 3 secrets for success if you're caring about building an engineering culture. And I also want to describe perhaps a simple recipe about how you go about doing this effectively. So let's begin and let's start with the why. One of the reasons this is such an important element is really recognizing that engineering talent is limited today. In terms of thinking about the sort of number of positions of software engineers versus the influx of people, was just simply outstripped for demand compared to the supply of different people coming into our industry. Think about the number of opportunities that you have if you're an engineer, or if you're a hiring manager, or if you're trying to hire into your organization, you know how tough this market is. Even in a distributed world, this is becoming a lot more difficult because people can access talent regardless of the current location. And one of the interesting things about software is that we have a lot of people who come up with new ideas. There's startups all the time. In a sort of large enterprise, you have large departments coming up with ideas. And it's very easy to have ideas. As an engineer, you have ideas as well. Every team member has 2 or 3 ideas. Ideas are not the problem. The constraint and the bottleneck today is trying to prioritize which ideas or hypotheses you try so that you actually have a chance of building them. And we know from software, once you've built something, this is really hard to sustain because you actually have to keep going as well. And so once you have something that's successful, you can't just simply build new things. You also have to evolve your current stack and make sure that they work, which is not easy. And today, software is pretty much everywhere. There's that term that software is eating the world and has eaten the world. Whether or not we like it, software is embedded in many devices that are accessible to everywhere that we are using. And it's becoming even more prolific. We're starting to wear devices, and people are starting to experiment with embedding software into their own selves as well. And so one of the interesting things is that it's never going to stop. It's going to keep growing. And yet we still have a sort of war for talent, and there's not enough software engineers for the number of positions that we need. And so we're going to end up in this position for quite a long time, which is a reassuring thing if you're a software engineer, because you have so many endless opportunities to be able to build stuff, which is essential today. But in today's world, particularly if you're a tech lead, engineering manager, or somebody in a hiring manager position, you kind of look at what your organization would like to do, the many ideas that your organization would like to have, and then you look at your team and perhaps the people that you can actually hire. And the question is, how do you fill these vacancies? What are you going to do to actually make sure that you can get the talent that you need in order to test the hypotheses or the ideas that you'd like to actually deliver? And this is really onto you, which is why engineering culture matters. Now, one of the interesting things about engineers is with all of these different choices, ultimately, many people will decide what is best for them and not just simply based on how much they can earn. Engineers aren't necessarily motivated only by money. In fact, people aren't only motivated by money. There are many different reasons why people want to work in a particular environment, and the environment and the culture that they're going to join really makes a difference. So we've talked about the why. It's important to think about what is your engineering culture to attract the types of engineers that you want to have. Let's talk about the 3 secrets that I've observed over time about what makes success in what is key to a successful engineering culture. We're going to look at 3 different elements. And the first one here is really about impact. In order to have a successful engineering culture, engineers need to have impact. What do I mean by that? There are 3 areas what I think make sense in terms of making sure that engineers have impact. The first one is obviously customer impact. Be whatever it is that people are doing, engineers would like to see the results or the impact that they're having on end users. One of the things that engineers are often maybe sort of pulled away from is they're busy doing things, and so they don't actually see the outcome. So there may be customer impact, but they may not have the visibility of what they've actually achieved. And in order for engineers to feel the impact, they need to understand and see the outcome as a result. The other thing that motivates engineers are that they're constant problem solvers. And so one of the sort of ideas about having impact, if they're not particularly working on a customer-facing issue, is that they want to feel that they've solved an interesting puzzle. And interesting is a hard thing because interesting is very variable depending on that person. But there are many traps that organizations fall into in terms of building organizations that prevent people from understanding their impact. Well, let's have a look at a couple of these things. So one of the things that often happens is engineers are sort of squirreled away very far away from the customer. So engineers are busy with their development team, or they're talking to other people in their organization. This gets naturally harder as the organization grows because there are so many people involved, or many different sort of leaps to actually understand what's happening with a customer. In a lot of organizations, there's so much of pressure about making engineers efficient. So how productive can I make engineers, that they become a feature factory where features are sort of outlaid for people and engineers are expected to simply build those features. And people don't really understand why they're building those features and what the impact is. They're really concerned about building features, which isn't really conducive to a strong engineering culture. The other sort of element that often happens is people end up too solution focused. So by the time that people have come up with what the customer needs are, how you're actually going to solve it, by the time a developer gets involved, the solution has already been prescribed and engineers don't get a chance to actually think about how they're actually going to build something themselves. In terms of seeing the outcome, one thing that happens if in a lot of organizations is that there's a lot of handoffs. So information or marketing people or customer services might collect feedback from customers, but it passes through several departments or teams before it actually gets to a developer, which makes it really hard for people to understand what the actual outcome was. One of the other consequences of larger enterprises, which is why startups are an interesting place, is often you have slower feedback loops. So, you might be building software, and if your release cadence is every month, you don't really understand the impact of that until at least the month is over when you've released some software to users. And so it's very hard to understand what work you've done today and the impact that it potentially has had on customers when it's been so long in the past. And in an obsessive need to make engineers productive, a lot of organizations fall into the trap about trying to keep engineers busy. And in a lot of places, sometimes this gets translated into an engineer working in multiple teams or multiple projects so that they can be busy, but at the same time, they're losing that sort of contact with the customer and understanding what the impact was of what they had. So avoid these if possible. Now, in terms of solving the problem, one thing that a lot of companies get obsessed with is about outputs, not outcomes. So, people are really focused on the activity. How much code did people produce? How many features did they produce? Rather than thinking about, did they actually solve the key problem that they were hoping to have? A lot of organizations are obsessed with planning and making sure that they deliver to plan, but just because you have a plan doesn't mean that you'll reach the outcome that you have. You'll have a good chance, but there's no guarantee simply because the plan may be wrong. And one of the traps of keeping busy is often not taking the time to pause and reflect and to celebrate what you've actually achieved. And if you don't actually recognize that, you'll just feel like, as an engineer, you'll be moving on from one task to the next without actually recognizing what you've actually had as an impact and what problems you've solved along the way. So my principle here, if you're caring about this, is really to help cultivate impact by reducing feedback loops. So some of the concrete ideas I've seen implemented is helping engineers get closer to customers by shadowing people in customer services. There's one team that I worked in where we would do a weekly round, and one of us would actually listen in on sort of customer service issues. And I remember one instance where I heard an interesting complaint from a customer, and a developer said, "Hey, I can fix this. I know what this problem is, and I can do this in an afternoon." And so you get immediate satisfaction because you know the customer problems a lot more intimately when it's not being handed through many different layers. One of the key reasons why I think Agile has been so successful is this encouragement of really delivering in smaller increments. The smaller increments that you can deliver and ship to end customers, the earlier you get that feedback, the earlier you can understand if it's actually having an impact on customers, and if not, maybe you can change your strategy. Or if so, you can amplify more of that, but you can only do that if you're delivering in small increments. Now, OKRs are very powerful if they're used very well. When they're misused, of course, they can also not be so effective. But one of the benefits of OKRs is they should roll up to the bigger why. What outcome are we actually trying to achieve? What is my work connected to, and how does it actually move the company forward and the company mission forward? And so OKRs, when done well, can help developers really connect their work to the impact that their team is having, to their product, and to the organization and mission as a whole. And finally, one of the things that particularly engineering managers or tech leads can focus on is really focusing on this idea of accelerating release speed and frequency. So it's very difficult to release incrementally if your continuous delivery process can only do this every 2 weeks. Now imagine how different that would be if you could release at the click of a button and on demand. So accelerate release frequency and speed. The second secret we're going to look at after impact is really this idea about choice. Now, I don't talk about autonomy because I think autonomy is so misunderstood. So let's talk about choice. The second secret about a strong engineering culture is having enough choice. And what do I mean by this? Choice in terms of the solution, so how people build things. Choice in how they would like to work, so not necessarily mandated from above. The other thing is really choice is really about a degree of freedom and making sure that you're clear about what those degrees of freedom are. Let's look at some of the traps that companies fall into for each of these. So with solution choice, what often happens is some architect mandating a particular framework or tool that a team has to use without a good communication about why or whatnot. Another trap that companies can fall into is developers getting really involved late in the process. A healthy sign of a strong engineering culture are when developers get involved in brainstorming what are potential solutions to customer problems. And that's quite different if you've already been prescribed a feature in a ticket in Jira when everything has already been prescribed. You don't feel like you have much choice as a result. The other thing that is often happening is the output is predetermined. Some designer has come up with multiple screenshots, and all you have to do is simply implement it as is prescribed in the design. So watch out for having very prescribed outputs. Now, there's a lot of traps around how to work as well. So one of the interesting things as an organization grows is you want to not necessarily have a single way of working. If you have too much uniformity, your culture is going to be too brittle, but at an engineering level, you're also going to feel constrained. You don't have that freedom. One of the best ways that you can cultivate this is really thinking about teams choosing how they'd like to work, but also agreements at an organizational level where teams need to cross-collaborate. One of the things that you have to watch out for are prescriptive processes. This is one of the reasons why Scaled agile frameworks like SAFe are really damaging because they're prescribing the single way of working across the entire organization without really understanding what is needed at a per team basis. Perhaps it makes sense for a team to choose Kanban at this time. Perhaps another team chooses XP because they have more planning that they need to actually have in order to deliver to a customer. The other thing that is often perhaps maybe too extreme on the choice is optimizing for the individual. So if you're optimizing for the individual and allowing an individual to work however they like, you're probably not actually building a team. And this is where choice is really quite key, because you need to choose what you optimize for. And in today's world of building software, it's best to optimize for the team. If you're optimizing for an individual and you let them sort of work exactly how they'd like to work, then you'll end up with a suboptimal team that won't be as resilient as an individual. Now, what do I mean by degrees of freedom? In any organization, in any culture, you're going to have some limit to your freedom. And what's key here is making sure that the rules or the degrees of freedom aren't too heavyweight. So the constraints about things that people don't need to worry about should be quite clear. But if they're getting in the way of what people are actually doing to get their normal day, their normal work done, it's not really going to be so effective. The other thing that often happens quite a lot is we don't want to have too many rules, so let's not have any rules. But there are always rules. There are always implicit rules or expectations. And this can create a lot more frustration because people think that they have a choice until perhaps they get slapped over the wrist or they get talked to by somebody else, and there's a mismatch of expectations. So one of the reasons why I think it's very important to be clear about degrees of freedom is to be clear about where people have that choice, because too much freedom can create too many decision dilemmas and you're not going to get anything done. The other difficulty here is really having autonomy versus alignment. So you can have a lot of autonomy, but if people are working in different ways, once again, too many maybe individualistic opportunities, they're going to work against each other and therefore not be aligned. So one of the reasons why it's quite key to think about degrees of freedom is about how you align a team to build a strong engineering culture, rather than building a culture of one, which may not work for other people in your team or your organization. And one of the things that definitely contributes to this is really unclear decision-making processes. And it happens all the time, particularly in today's environment of really rapid, fluid organizations, is that things change all the time. It's unclear who is accountable or who is responsible for doing the work or making the decision. And one of the things that I would often do as a manager is really try to go in and really clarify the boundaries of decision making, because that helps people understand where they have choice, where they have input. And that's quite a key element to help people understand and minimize frustration. There's nothing more frustrating than thinking that you have a decision-making authority over something only to find out it belongs to somebody else. So my principle for element number 2 of building a successful engineering culture is really cultivating choice by making the right thing easy. Now, that sounds easy, but how do you do this? Here's a couple of tips. The first one is automate the basics, right? So if you agree as a team about a particular code style, use a tool to make that easier. Use a linter, use an automatic formatter that your team shares. So it stops becoming a discussion and it just becomes something you don't have to worry about. You can focus on interesting choices that actually have impact or value. So automate the basics. And we're seeing a lot more of this, particularly in the continuous delivery space, around build and deployment infrastructure automation, to make sure that those things just become the standard way of working and people can focus on more interesting problems. The second thing is really thinking about, rather than rules, prefer principles. The problem with rules is that there's always some exception to the rule, and people will blindly follow rules without really thinking about the intent. If you have good principles, what you have is effectively things that guide decisions. So the really good example here is the 12-factor application, which was sort of famous for understanding what are the principles for building cloud-native software. Now, there will always be exceptions, but the interesting thing about principles is they generate more discussions. Does it make sense to violate this principle, or what is the trade-off of violating this principle in our particular circumstance? Principles, when done well, should help people for 80% of the time, have a very clear choice. And where you have those exceptions, to have some guidance about why it maybe makes sense to have an exception in a particular case. The third thing here is really making sure you set up the goal and step out of the way. So one of the hardest things about being a leader or manager is delegating not the decision about what needs to be done, but how it needs to get done. And this is a trap that a lot of engineers find themselves when they first move into a leadership role, is that they want to have it done exactly how they would have built it, be it your breakdown of algorithm, be it your service design. One of the best ways of cultivating choice is actually being clear about what you're trying to achieve, and then giving people the idea about what are the constraints to maybe make that happen. And the constraints might be some of the principles or some of the automated basics. But if you're really getting involved in detailed decisions to the point where you have made all the decisions, you're probably not cultivating enough choice for other people who then would like to maybe have some more say in those decisions. The fourth thing is really clarifying decision-making boundaries. So in any organization, there are limits to your decision-making capabilities. As an example, I'm working on one particular team. I wouldn't be dictating how another team should build their service, because that's completely up to them about how they construct and architect their service. I might care about the data exchange format that we are needing to agree on, but it's not really my decision about how they're actually going to build that service. And that can get really fuzzy in a lot of organizations as people swap teams, or even in a team with flexible roles, people think that they are responsible for maybe having an opinion on something, but it's not clear about how much their input is going to be taken into that decision-making process. As organizations get bigger, this becomes more of a challenge around particularly those things that fall between teams. So be it around a service design, about maybe what's the common exception handling mechanism across all of the different teams, or perhaps it's about the observability of different services and making sure that there's some consistency. Often these lack of clarities creates frustration because it's unclear about who needs to be involved in which choices. Let's move on to the third and final secret to a strong engineering culture. And this is really about improvement. Now, there are three areas that I think about improvement here. One is personal growth. We want to see ourselves improve. Everyone wants to grow at some point. We want to see steps to improvement to what our company mission is trying to achieve. We don't really want to just work on some technical task feeling like we're not actually moving towards a particular mission and not having some sort of outcome. And we really want to have some improvement in the environment in which we work. And let's talk about some of the traps here. So one of the challenges for a company that's not growing is there's often no new experiences for people to grow. And so one of the challenging aspects of any leader and manager is helping people identify what are opportunities for people to grow. It may be as simple as rotating people on a team with what they're doing, so they have an opportunity to build skills and things that they've never done, or to start planning for a different role in a different team to give them exposure to a different experience. But making sure that there are some growth opportunities is really key to personal growth. The other thing you have to watch out for is when people say, I want to work on interesting work, is over time, that interesting work becomes boring, right? Nobody likes to do the same thing day in, day out. And so this is a trap that is easy to fall into because you think everyone's growing, everyone's really happy. But fast forward 6 or 12 months, and people who have maybe grown to learn some new things, maybe just repeating them day in, day out, but they need new growth opportunities in order to grow and learn. So you always have to watch out for this and find ways to sort of push people into new experiences to help them grow. Now, a key part of improvement is really understanding what elements you should improve on. And so this is something that a lot of organizations fail to do in terms of they're so busy producing work that they forget to make sure that they cultivate a feedback culture, right? So that there's no support in terms of what elements that you can improve on, what opportunities you have to grow in that, and what you can do to prepare yourself for perhaps a new growth opportunity. And the biggest trap that a lot of people have at a personal level is a fear of failure, right? So one of the hardest things about growing is you're going to make some mistakes. And a natural part of that is you need an environment where you feel safe to make mistakes. And one thing that can really hold people back is this idea of a fear of failure, of that I don't want to try something new, I'm happy with what I'm doing, I'm bored with what I'm doing, but I need to do something differently, but I don't want to fail, right? So a little bit of failure is quite key to actually growing, because we learn through making mistakes, hopefully small mistakes, but we need to feel safe in order to do so. The key thing that I've learned as a leader and manager is recognizing that bored people will quit. So, everyone at some point in their career or at some point in their current role will get bored just because they need new experiences. It's kind of the human condition. We adapt to our environment, we learn, we grow, but once we grow, the same thing becomes that repetitive thing. And this is the key thing, that if you're going to maintain this and a strong engineering culture, you have to find ways to keep people engaged, which is why it's so key and important. Traps for steps to the mission is, if you don't have clear priorities, it's very hard for an engineer to understand what they're doing and how that connects to the bigger, broader mission as a company. It's one of the reasons why OKRs can be very powerful, because they're connecting your sort of individual work to teamwork, to a department or to a product, and to the overall company mission. And this is really about closing that mission task gap. If you ask an engineer, why are you doing the thing that you're doing, and how does that connect to what your company is trying to achieve, a good test is to see if they can answer that. If they can't, they don't really understand perhaps the connections or the why about what they're working on, and that's something to really address. And a key thing that sort of maybe confuses this, particularly in larger organizations, it's just very hard to know what's going on. So, in a small startup, you can turn around and maybe talk to the founder and actually ask, how are we doing with customers? But in a larger organization, particularly in today's world of a lot more distributed remote virtual environments, this is a lot more difficult. And so this is something that you really have to work on in terms of thinking about, what do you do to create clarity? Where can people pull information from to understand how their work contributes to what the company is doing, or how other teams are actually helping to move the company forward towards their mission as well. The final sort of element or trap in sort of thinking about improvements is what changes in the work environment. I often talk about good managers. They're not managing people, they're managing the environment to make sure that people can work to bring out their best. And so, one of the things I listen for in a lot of cultures is if you have a lot of people that say that won't work here, it's often a sign that people have maybe tried to improve the environment and it's been unsuccessful and it's too static, right? One of the sort of opposite things I'd be listening for is hearing people say, oh yeah, let's give it a go, and maybe it will fail, right? So if you have people that immediately dismiss ideas, it's probably a culture that's not really encouraging failure, or people have been burnt by failure in the past and they don't want to try things in the future. And another sign that I'd be looking for is people feel sort of meek. They don't propose ideas. They wait to be asked. They wait until a manager asks, what are the problems that are going on? One of the good signs of a good engineering culture is where everyone feels empowered to act. Everyone feels that they can improve something about the way that they work. It's one of the reasons why I think Agile has been so successful, because it's pushed it away from being a single person responsible for building an environment to asking people to improve their environment through tools like retrospectives. Now, one of the things that definitely sort of doesn't help in a work environment is, once again, this lack of feedback, right? So be it about lack of feedback about how your product is doing, lack of feedback about maybe the quality of the work that you're producing, or at a personal level, the feedback about how you're actually developing and growing as a person. And so a key element, once again, to a strong engineering culture is really making sure that there are mechanisms to get feedback at different levels, at different cadences. So my principle here is really cultivating improvements by making small changes easier. So what do I mean this? So it's not enough just to have retrospectives. You need to take action. So one of the things that I would do when I'm leading a team is making sure that all the actions we take up or agree as a team actually happen, right? There's nothing more frustrating than simply bringing up the same issue again and again, agreeing to make some change, and it never happens. That leads to the whole "that won't work here" attitude, because we don't actually see any visible change. It takes action to actually make that happen. The other thing, that is very common is making sure that from incidents you do postmortems. So you're improving the system. It's not just simply who's to blame for this outage, the outage is over and you keep going. It's really what in our system contributed to this outage? How do we improve that system to prevent that from happening again and again? And that's a really strong attitude that everyone in an organization should make. Making sure that you have forums for shared lessons learned is really key. So pollinating cross-learning and cross-teams within your team is a really key indicator about making sure that people have opportunities to improve. Not everyone has to make the same mistake twice, right? So we can learn from other people's mistakes, but we can only do that if we hear what mistakes people have made and learn from their lessons learned as well. And one of the things that definitely helps with growth paths is making them explicit. So in a more established company, you will have these in terms of career ladders or growth ladders. But in sort of startup lands, these are things that are often missing that make sort of unclear about what opportunities do people have to grow and how do people get there if they're going to improve themselves. So we've looked at the why, we've looked at these 3 secrets. Let's talk about the how. And it's a really simple 5-step recipe that I have for you. The first here is really about making sure that you gather input. So if you're an engineering leader, if you're somebody who's responsible for the engineering culture, talk to people, run retrospectives, understand what it is about your sort of engineering culture that makes it unique, makes it great. The second thing is really about publishing your tech culture. So every company is different. If I was to compare how Amazon works versus Netflix versus Google, each one has a very different culture, and it's worth articulating what parts of that culture you want to cultivate. Now, if you're trying to change your culture, you want to focus on articulating those parts of the culture that you want to amplify, and maybe not necessarily highlight those parts of the culture that you're trying to maybe remove or dampen as a result. But articulating what your tech culture is really quite key, because people don't really understand what it is that they need to do in order to repeat things unless it's explicit. And so encompassing this and defining your tech culture is quite important if you're going to cultivate this and amplify it. Now, with culture, like a garden, you're never done. There's always something that you can do to continue to improve it, to make it stronger, to make it more resilient. And so a key part of, once listening to team members or your organization is really try to identify what parts of your culture can you focus on that will actually make it stronger overall, right? So cultures don't stay strong. You have to continually invest in actually making these things great. And when I think about the really great engineering cultures in the companies, they are very deliberate in this. They really think very deliberately about what they want to do, what elements they actually want to improve as well. Is it about growth? Is it about choice? There are always elements that are never going to be as strong as what you'd like to have. But a key to making it strong is making sure that you prioritize key improvement areas. Like a retrospective, the 4th element to improving an engineering culture is really making decisions and making sure you make clear actions and take care of them. The hard thing about this at a management or a leadership level is it's never going to be as easy to do as working at a team level. If you're leading or managing an organization of say 50 or 100 engineers, gathering input, taking action isn't something that you're going to be able to probably execute on immediately after 1 week. The horizons for something like engineering culture is more in the order of, say, a month or 3 months worth of actions. And you can only really focus on 1 to 3 different elements in that time frame because you're going to be busy doing many other things as well. But just like retrospectives are frustrating if you don't actually see any improvement, people won't really believe you that you're investing in the culture unless they actually see visible improvements. So approach this like a very deliberate action in improving your culture by looking at a horizon of 1 to 3 months, making sure you prioritize those key areas you want to strengthen or improve on, and then making sure that you demonstrate action around that. If you're trying to develop learning opportunities, perhaps it's about making sure after 3 months that there's a sustainable learning forum where people have time to go to, that you have people that are willing to share information, and actually you're cultivating that as a habit from an organization perspective as well. And the next and final step of this recipe is really making sure that you repeat, rinse and recycle. This is something that you're not really going to ever be done with. It's not something that you're finished with. There's no end state. The hard thing about culture, like everything, is that it evolves over time. We need it to adapt to the environment. There'll be elements of our culture that we'll like. In today's world, we're probably all trying to enhance the way that we collaborate more distributed, more remotely. And so you're going to be focusing on different elements as the situation changes overall. Your company, if it's going through an acquisition or growing really rapidly, there are different elements of that culture which will need to work quite differently than if you were, a scrappy little startup all sitting together in a single location. So these are all the different simple 5-step recipes to really improving a strong engineering culture. We've looked at three different sort of keys, and I want to give you 3 simple questions to make a test of how good your culture is. The first thing is asking yourself, how many handoffs do you have between software engineers and customers? How many people, how many roles get in the way? Do engineers have visibility of customer metrics, or do they have to ask for a report, which is through their product manager, which is through marketing, which is through maybe some other random people? Right? So count the number of handoffs, and the shorter, the better. The second question is, are software engineers involved how they solve the problem? Or are they handed a specification with detailed sort of details, or worse, are they just handed tasks and tickets which have been created by somebody? The more that you can involve software engineers in the solution creation process, the more engaging that engineering culture will be. The third question I would ask is, what explicit opportunities have you got for software engineers to grow? It may not necessarily be about new sort of career, it may not be about new roles or promotions. It may be about new experiences and opportunities to do something they've never done before. Even simply something like a tour of duty of rotating between teams creates opportunities to learn, which doesn't require a new title or a new role in your organization. And you can map these 3 questions to each of these 3 elements to actually measure and understand how good your engineering culture is in the organization that you're in. And if you're a leader or a manager, about what you can do to improve this. So to wrap up, just a reminder, engineers have an opportunity to choose whatever they'd like to sort of work in, and we're never going to be done with this problem. There will always be a sort of shortage of engineers versus what we actually need to have. And so part of your role is really trying to understand what you can do to cultivate the engineer that you have and make it stronger. If you'd like to learn a little bit more, I've included some book references in the slides, and the slides will be shared later. But these are all elements that I think are very strong towards building a strong engineering culture. I want to thank you all for listening, and I think we have some time for questions.
We do. Thank you very much, Patrick. So we have a few minutes, and we got one question that has been upvoted by lots of other people. So Thomas says, why should teams not have a say in what he calls problem choice? We often see that the choice of solutions does not matter if the wrong problem is actually being solved. So yeah, it looks like there's 3 questions back to back. Let's do that one first. So why shouldn't teams have a say in the choice of problem that's being solved?
So I think teams should get close to the choice of problem if possible. But ultimately, the CEO is choosing the direction of where the company is going, and people will choose priorities. Now, in terms of the problem that's being chosen, it takes a lot of time and a lot of information gathering to actually work out what is the most key problem to actually solve. So as an example, you have to talk to customers, you have to collect feedback. There is a lot of work involved in that, and engineers can get involved in that, but it's maybe not necessarily their strength. I know a lot of engineers that don't like perhaps that. They maybe like to have a say in what they build, but not necessarily about the details around it. So in an organization, there's a lot of information that you have to sort of prepare in order to sort of prioritize different types of choices as well. The other thing that a lot of engineers miss out from, which obviously people can improve on, but it isn't necessarily their key focus, is the sort of commercial or business mindset. So there are many choices about why certain problems get chosen, be it around financial incentives or growth opportunities, and there's a lot of sort of complexities with sort of the business modeling. So if you have an opportunity that engineers can get involved in problem choice and you don't need to go through that, that's fine. I think it's definitely more engaging for a lot of people, but it just takes up a lot more time. And a lot of engineers don't necessarily want to do that. So they'd rather get involved in the sort of, not the problem selection, but really about how you actually solve the problems that you have. That's where a lot of engineers take a lot more sort of delight.
There is just one thing that I'd like to add to that, if I may, which is
Sure.
there are very few software engineers I've ever met who will turn around and go, "We shouldn't build this. Software is not the solution to this problem. We can do this with manual process, paper, and hiring some interns until we figure it out." And often, I think that's a consequence of corporate environments where the decision has already been made that automation and software is the answer before, folks like us are even invited to the table. And then they're like, "How are you going to do it?" And at that point, you saying, "No, we shouldn't be in this room. This is not a software thing." And I've seen so many examples of something being automated before they'd really figured out what it was they were trying to automate. So I think that's another, interesting one that perhaps brings some of the responsibility for that back to the developers, is having the willingness to say, "No, we shouldn't be writing
Yes,
code for this yet. We're going to do something else while you figure out your business process. Then come talk to us." But for a lot
absolutely.
of us, that means turning down a paycheck, so we're not very good at doing that.
Agreed. And I would say that's part of the solutioning process, right? If a business person is coming to somebody and saying, I want you to build this software, that's maybe, they haven't clarified what the problem is, but there is a problem that they're trying to solve. And maybe you as a developer are saying, actually, to solve your problem, the best solution is not to write software, is to define a process, do it manually first, and then see how that goes. And so that's the element that, a lot of software engineers haven't quite yet mastered either, of saying, maybe
Yeah.
not software. But that's the solutioning process, not really about that problem.
Cool, thank you. So we got another question from Thomas. Do you have examples of good tech culture documents? How do you describe a tech culture so that it can be published in the first place?
So there are sort of examples of this. I want to sort of discriminate this by saying it's arguable about whether you think their culture is good or not. So I want to sort of first say that. But I think there's a couple of different sort of cultures that are sort of well communicated out there. So one of them is, for instance, the Netflix sort of playbook, right? So there's a playbook that goes out there that talks about how Netflix kind of operates and their sort of culture within that. There's Amazon and its sort of leadership principles. And if you understand Amazon and you look at their leadership principles, you can project how they're going to work within their sort of organization as well. So you can sort of think about that element of, if you're joining as a leader or if you're working in a team, what are my leaders? How are they going to be rewarded? What's that sort of culture from that particular side? One of the interesting things with culture is the sort of short, pithy type of things, right? And Facebook's well known for its move fast and break things. You could argue that's not a great culture, but it's the culture, and they've articulated that. And that's evolved over time as well as they've grown, which is, I forget how it's become. It's not necessarily as effective or pithy, but it's move fast and maybe don't break as many things. Still move fast. I don't know. Um, So there's a couple of those different examples out there. And I think the hard thing is really, there's no one format that makes sense, right? So it could just be a slide deck, it could be a website, and Spotify is well known for its sort of tribe model. People describe it as the Spotify model, but it's just a snapshot of where they were. And it gives you a sense about how their culture is and how they sort of work, right? So I wouldn't be so focused on exactly how to articulate it. I would really focus on sort of distilling what your culture is and then deciding what's the best way that represents your culture to communicate that.
Great answer, thank you. Justinas has a question. How do you cure the attitude of solving the problem ASAP and then just leave it because it was solved/working, even though it's hard coded or something similar?
This sounds a bit like either a technical debt or a quality issue. I think one of the things that I probably implied within the engineering culture here was really about this sort of idea of improvement, right? And this is also about improvement of the code and systems, and that good engineering cultures recognize, for instance, when they have to revisit something, but also good engineering cultures recognize when they don't, right? So sometimes the case might be it's okay to leave something hard-coded because you're never going to revisit it again. Like, who knows, right? And you have some other places which are maybe so obsessed by trying to make everything reusable, totally abstract and totally adaptable, that they forget about delivering value and solving customer needs, and that code will never be touched again. And so that's a lot of sort of time, thought in something that hasn't actually been useful. I think my sort of rule of thumb here is going back to the idea of small increments and impact. Is that if you know you're going to be working in a certain area for a certain amount of time, the smaller increments that you can make it, the quicker you get a sense about which parts of the code are changing more rapidly. And where those things are changing more rapidly, I would invest a lot more time in sort of refactoring or redesign, because you'll get that payback immediately, right? So one of the things I've learned from refactoring is you don't refactor every part of the code. You kind of try to refactor where you're going to get the most value. And one of the places you're going to get the most value is by making the next change easier. And you get a good sense of that if you're working in much smaller increments. So that would be my answer to that.
Great answer, thank you. And finally, one more before we wrap it up. It's David Ostrowski. Hey, David, how are you? David says, Patrick, do you see any changes in what good engineering culture is in response to the increase in remote work?
Yes. So I will also qualify this, because good is also a different perspective. So, for people who are maybe more remote native, it is obviously good. But I will say that cultures are changing, right, because of the forced nature. So for companies that were very heavily synchronous in person, in office, they're trying to explore and adapt to working more remotely. And I think there are also beneficial things to that. So one of the negative things that happens when you're, too co-located is people sort of rely on face-to-face conversation when they can write things down. And writing things down scales a lot more effectively. You don't have to interrupt somebody, and more sort of asynchronous sort of methods. At the same time, if you only rely on asynchronous methods, people are people. We need human connections, right? We need to sort of connect with people. I know remote teams still come together before COVID once a year to try to meet up personally, because they know that human relationships are really key to building trust and working sort of cultures. So I would say definitely culture has to shift if people are going to be effective in this new environment. Depending on how they're doing it, you could argue it's good or bad.
Great stuff. Thank you, Patrick. And yes, Nestus has shared the timeless observation: there is nothing more permanent than a temporary solution. Great stuff. Thank you so much, Patrick Kwa, for joining us this morning. Thank you.